longtime volunteer worker for, with refugees who retired through the Episcopal Refugee Service. So she's got a wonderful reflections of her own work and the work of others.
Yes. I also have a little info up here about myself as well, just to give you a little background. I have done some projects with Episcopal Migration Ministries. I work with Spiritus Immigration and Refugee Services, which is a local resettlement agency through the Lutheran Church. And also have worked with Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, which is a secular organization in Tennessee. That's my kind of refugee immigrant background as far as work goes. I've worked in other areas like disaster recovery, public health. I did a chaplaincy training program with Church of the Common Ground in Atlanta, which is an Episcopal worshiping community. And my personal experience with immigration was sponsoring my wife for her green card. She's from India, and I got to see up close and personal how our immigration system is not so great. It was definitely quite the experience. We, as a same-sex couple, got married shortly after it became legal, and then went through that process, and we experienced discrimination when we went through our green card interview. Luckily, everything turned out okay, and she does have permanent residency. But it was quite the eye-opening experience. I knew a lot about folks who had been through various immigration situations, but living it was another story. I also ended from Vanderbilt, and part of how I got involved with working in various ministries with immigrants. It's just a desire to do ministry as a LGBTQ person in a diocese that is definitely on the tail end of accepting LGBTQ people. It's a little harder to go for the traditional ministries. Those doors are harder to open. So this felt like something that I could do that would be able to help people in a similar way.
Is it possible for you to speak a little bit louder?
Yes.
To compete with here.
Yes, I did hear it just come on.
Thank you.
Yeah, if at any point you can't hear me, please flag me down. I can be very loud, but if I don't know, I may not. So just a very, very brief history of refugee resettlement in the Episcopal Church. A lot of you may know some of this background, but I didn't know all of it. So refugee resettlement started out with, during the time period that people were fleeing Nazis, the 1930s, 1940s, the Presiding Bishops Fund for World Relief was put together to help some of those folks who were fleeing. And then the Episcopal Church became a part of Church World Service. There were 16 Protestant denominations, and Church World Service still exists. And they joined there, and then there was a resurgence of refugees during the Vietnam War, after the Vietnam War. And in 1980, Congress established a resettlement program, which is what we have kind of known for the last few decades as refugee resettlement in the U.S. The Bishops Fund continued during that time, and then in 1988, Episcopal Migration Ministries was established. So we had a separate arm that was able to do resettlement in the U.S. And as we all know, we kind of jump a whole bunch there because there was a lot of good ministry that was done during that time. But we all have probably heard that in 2025, funding was just completely cut for the refugee resettlement program, which I think anyone who's worked in refugee resettlement expected there to be cuts, but I don't think most of us expected it to just completely be cut off, and to be cut off so fast that even people who were already here, the funding was gone for the things that they needed to get settled. People who had plane tickets in hand were not able to step on those planes. And at that point, I was doing some work with Episcopal Migration Ministries as a contract worker, and it just some good things. Next slide. So this is just, these are some of our staff that I worked with when I was with Inspiritus, which was the Lutheran organization. My daughter is also there as a volunteer. The rest of the folks are our staff. This is we did a coat drive every year. Our central office was in Atlanta, and they didn't totally understand that Nashville gets cold a little bit earlier than Atlanta does, so that coat drive was usually way too late. But we did do a coat drive to try to get folks coats to deal with the winters here. I think there's a lot of, refugees obviously are marginalized. You can't get status as a refugee unless you have been through some kind of trauma and you qualify as a person who can flee for that reason. And only 1%, even when we had the program, running more in the U.S. and throughout the world, only 1% of people who were in that system of having gotten asylum and being in line to be resettled in a third country, only 1% were getting resettled. So that's some of the most marginalized and vulnerable people who actually ended up coming to the U.S. After either sometimes they were in refugee camps, sometimes they were in apartments in cities and that sort of thing. The person here who is in the middle, he was one of our staff members, but he was also a refugee who came in through our system. It was the first time that I personally got to go to the airport to pick someone up. I picked up his family, and it just kind of feels very life-changing to be that first person who's standing there when someone steps off a plane and they're exhausted and trying to figure out where they're supposed to go, and all of that. His name is Rohair. We did not know that his name was pronounced Rohair until we knew him probably a year, which is it's kind of an example of how we can do the work badly. We just assumed his name was pronounced Roger because in the U.S. the name is pronounced Roger, but his name is Pereira, and it took us a little while to figure that out. As far as telling stories of individual refugees, those stories are theirs to tell. So very often we would hear some of the background, some of the things that they had been through, the things that had given them that refugee status so that they could be resettled. But those stories are theirs to tell, but I can kind of tell our story as far as our doing work with them, and very often what we learned and the mistakes that we made. Like not asking someone how to pronounce his name. But he moves from being a refugee to being a colleague of ours very, very quickly. And he has left that work and is doing the stuff that he went to college for and the stuff that he dreamed of doing now. There is a lot, what I found is my coworkers had a lot of talent, and this is another way that we see marginalization, a lot of talent, very, very low pay. Almost everybody was making less than the refugees were making when we put them in their first jobs to do this sort of ministry, but people cared so much that they wanted to be able to help others. And I also think we were able to get some very talented folks, because there's discrimination out there when they go to try to find jobs. Their talents are not always recognized, or the things that they learned in another country don't translate as easily as you would hope to come here. So for me, what I got really excited about and really into was working with LGBTQ refugees. Another thing that I had been doing just as volunteer work before I got involved with refugees was LGBTQ plus advocacy, especially in this diocese where we're latecomers to being able to welcome people as well as we should, but also just in general, the state of Tennessee has not been the most welcoming place for folks. So I had already been doing some of that, And then one day, I found out we often didn't know who was going to be showing up on the plane until sometimes the last minute. Sometimes it would be a few days, sometimes we'd have a couple weeks, but every once in a while we'd find out almost the day of. But I found out we had a family coming in that was LGBTQ. Our case manager wasn't quite sure. He had figured that out. He wasn't quite sure if someone was trans or if they were a lesbian couple or what. So he was kind of guessing there. But he figured that out, and so I got to go to the airport and pick up this family. This is a photo of them from the social media. Once they had been a little more resettled, but I got to go to the airport and pick them up as the only LGBTQ staff. Actually, when I started, we had 2 full-time staff, including me, and 1 contract worker. So we really didn't have a whole lot. And at this point, I think we had maybe hired a little bit more, but we didn't have any. So my Spanish is really awful. It's really bad, but I practiced, and I had an interpreter, ready on the phone to call, but I practiced my Spanish the night before, trying to get ready, and managed to pick them up at the airport, get them in the car and drive them to a restaurant, and we went to a restaurant from their culture to eat. We had that first lunch together. I managed to get through all of that before I had to get an interpreter to take them to their apartment. I'm not going to try to translate a lease. That's yeah, I don't know that. It was just really, like, for me to be able to welcome folks who had experienced some of the discrimination that my family had experienced, but even on a larger level, felt like just a huge gift and opportunity to be able to do that. The first question they asked me as we were driving out of the garage at the Nashville airport was, does it snow here? Luckily I did understand what they were saying. And I said, un poquito, a little bit, not as much as some of y'all from the north could see, but occasionally we get snow. We had pupusas for lunch, and they told me how to eat them and how not to eat them. It was great. So, as far as a mistake that we made, because we definitely made mistakes along the way, one of our case managers, well, I went over to their house at one point. I was bringing over some donations that some folks had given, and so they invited me in for coffee. They took me on a tour of the house. We get to the bedroom. They pull up the blanket on their bed, and they point out the fact that they have 2 beds that they have shut together. And they laughed and they laughed and they laughed because our case manager had bought them 2 separate beds, even though they were a couple. There's ways that we discriminate against people that we don't think about, right? And luckily they took it in good humor and they just did the best they could with what they had. I don't know, eventually they bought a bed once they had been working for a while. That was one. But it's things that the case manager was not the type of person to intentionally discriminate, but he didn't even think. If it had been a straight couple, he bought single beds for them all the time. But in this case, he brought 2. So it helped. It's another way of learning where our biases are. I know my wife and I have experienced some of that as well. We go to queer spaces and they discriminate against her. The bartender's not serving her like he's serving the white people. And then we go to Indian spaces and it's the opposite. That is really one of the really difficult things, I think, is having multiple areas of cross-sectionality where it feels like you can't fit both of those things in either of those places. And that has been a hard thing. For me, I kind of felt like we're bringing LGBTQ refugees here, which should be safer, but it's also Tennessee. Like, why, it feels like the worst place we could have picked, maybe. Or one of the worst places we could have picked. It's like we got them out of the fire, but into the frying pan. There was a point where they started to go to church with some neighbors who were also Spanish speaking, and after going to the church for a little bit, they realized that it was not a welcoming church for them. And so we had some volunteers who were working with them. We had 4 different folks that worked with them at various points. 2 of them were Episcopalians. One of them tried really hard to find a church that would be Spanish speaking and welcoming to them, and could not find that. I ended up connecting them with Francisco Garcia, was here at St. Augustine's, and so they were able to connect and at least have somebody to talk to, but there wasn't a church for them to go to, which was difficult. But these folks had already had experience in their home country of doing work with LGBTQ people. They had, especially Alma, had done a lot of work advocating in her home country, and so they were very eager and ready to kind of join into some of that work here. So when they decided they wanted to become volunteers, we put on a special Spanish training for them. Had one of my coworkers help me out with that training, and so they went through the whole training just like everybody does. The first thing that they volunteered at was Pride, which is where this photo comes from. They came to Nashville Pride and got out there and started handing out handouts to people. They didn't seem to care that, they didn't speak much English at this point. Magali spoke some, but the other 2 were definitely at the beginning of learning. And if someone had questions, they would just route them over to us, but they really got out there better than any of my volunteers, engaging people and drawing people in. They also signed up to be what we call First Friends, where we connect those folks to new families coming in, and that's part of what the quote here is, that they volunteer because as refugees themselves, they can relate to others. And I did see that one of their names on a donation list at some point after I left the organization. So I know that they have kind of went the full circle to help out in every way that they could. The next thing, because of this work, I got really interested in it, put together a lot of information about LGBTQ refugees, and during that time I found out, hey, there's already folks doing this. In the Episcopal Church specifically, there were folks that were working on this. General Convention in 2022 passed a resolution supporting LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers, and it was 2023 that I was doing this work, so it coincided really well. And that, out of that came the Rainbow Initiative, which other folks had the primary work that was done there, but I became involved with that as well. I was able to do some work with them on updating their curriculum and their tools for churches that were supporting asylum seekers, and look for the ways to make it LGBTQ friendly. What I found was that curriculum had some big gaps in intersectionality, just like we found that we had when we were serving folks. That curriculum had that as well. So there was instructions, for example, about only having people share a bed if they were married, but folks like the family that we resettled could not legally get married where they were. Right? So, there wasn't any sort of thought of like, is this a couple versus were they able to legally get married? Another thing that I found is that we all know young men have to register for the selective service, and that includes refugees. They get here and almost immediately get registered for the selective service. But there was nothing in there about what do you do if you're a trans person, right? And that information is, or it was, I can't tell you what it is now, but at the time it was on government websites. If you are a trans woman, you still have to register for the selective service. if you are a trans man, you cannot register for selective service. And that's important information to know so that we get people doing, what they legally have to do. So there was lots of other stuff that we updated in that curriculum. Unfortunately, with all the cuts, I'm not sure that it's probably sitting on a computer somewhere. But it was good to kind of go through and realize what ways we needed to update things and do better. So as y'all know, Episcopal Migration Ministries did decide to lay off 22 of their workers, the consultants, the folks who were working on the Rainbow Initiative. And so we're kind of at the point, when I was asked to talk about this, like at the time I thought, how is this related to history? But we are at the point where this is kind of history. The way that we did things, the way that we resettled refugees really is history now. And we're at the point where we have to think of new ways forward because those existing methods, all that money that was coming in from the government, all of that stuff is just a thing of the past at this point. And there are lots of folks, of course, who have been doing that work, who have been thinking of ways forward, been accompanying people as they're dealing with all of the things that are going on. This next slide is just some photos, which are kind of fun. Of coworkers, volunteers. Everyone there is a coworker or a volunteer that I've worked with, except for one person, but she's an Episcopal, and I think she'll be fine with her being there. Just thinking of ways forward. One of the groups that we worked with when we were resettling refugees was a group from St. Augustine's here. I actually trained them in this chapel right here, so it's kind of familiar. And they helped to sponsor 2 refugee families during that time. And I know that they have continued to do that sort of work, rethinking it and doing it in different ways. So that's my experience with resettling refugees, working with various ministries with refugees. Yes?
When you started this work, because you had some personal experience of your own, when you started it, did you think in terms of the nitty-gritty as much as you got into the nitty-gritty when you met people at the airport and you did the very basic things? Is that what you expected on the journey, or was it much more granular than you expected?
I will say, first of all, the job that I took was community engagement. I was supposed to be working with the outward community in Nashville to get them involved in refugee resettlement and to lead the volunteers, train the volunteers, make sure they were background checked, all that stuff, and that they were doing the things they were supposed to do and not doing anything harmful, that sort of thing. I didn't think that I was coming in to actually show up at the airport to pick people up. That happened very often because we were such a small organization. So I really thought I was just going to learn a whole lot about refugees so I could help other people to resettle them, and that my experience has helped me to learn what it's like to interact with someone from a different culture. Because my wife will tell you that I've screwed up a lot. I screw up less now, but I was very clueless and dumb. It's not that I didn't know immigrants before that, but you have to put up with a white lady day after day. Being clueless, both sides learn some things, but I learned a lot. And so I felt like my experience would be able to help those volunteers to navigate those intercultural relationships a little bit better and maybe not make some of the mistakes. It didn't even occur, I didn't think about LGBTQ refugees too much. In my training, I did always mention that it's one of the reasons that you can get refugee status, but it wasn't until we we suddenly got this family that I started to get into the nitty-gritty of it and learning the details, learning about what some folks have been through, and really wanting to kind of communicate that to the community. When we went to Pride in Nashville, we had so many people who came up and said, you know, my boyfriend is from a country and it's not safe for him, and he needs, you know, he needs this information. We were able to connect a lot of people that way. It was great to find volunteers, but that seeing that it was really a need that was not being filled here in Nashville. The other resettlement agencies were not talking about it at that point. Since then, one of them did create a support group for LGBTQ refugees, but at the time, the resettlement agencies were not doing it. So I did kind of, I like to get into nitty gritty sometimes, like when I'm really interested in a subject, but I guess to answer your question, I didn't think that it would be that until it happened. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have thought about the pathway between congregation and social justice enterprise. Like you said, you were BNM or Turk, and we continue to do that here at St. Augustine, but I'm having a hard time delineating that pathway so that the congregation can get engaged, not burn out, and also nourished by the word. I wonder if you've had thoughts about that pathway between the church and the nonprofit.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. It is difficult. Our offices were in South Nashville, which is also where my family lives, and reaching out. Because we were a new resettlement agency in Nashville, and there were two that were very, very established. We were trying to find, you know, those folks that we could connect with, and what we found is that all the churches that were anywhere near us were just so saturated with doing that ministry already, and did not feel like they had the capacity to do more, and that's, you know, totally understandable. I mean, I briefly went to the Lutheran church that was next to our offices at the time, a wonderful church that had both a bunch of LGBTQ people and a bunch of refugees, and you don't see that together too often, but they did, and they're doing so much already. They also have a National Food Project, has a farm back behind their church where refugees are growing food and selling it, and you know, that's one of those social enterprise type things. But that type of stuff, I think, it can wear you out. And so I don't know the answer to the question of how that can be sustainable or.
Well, no, that's not my question, because that's definitely, I wouldn't bring that question on anybody. But my question is, what are the thoughts coming from a person who has been there? What have you observed?
Oh, yes.
And so I wonder if what you're observing is churches that are working on their own, like silos, rather than working together with the non-for-profit sector.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think there definitely is some of that. There is also a lot of folks that are working together. There is a conference that is put on every year called Only Together in Nashville, where a bunch of different nonprofits who work with refugees as well as churches that work with refugees, and that's where they get together. There is a coalition in Southeast Nashville, is something like Better Futures, that is working towards making things better in Southeast Nashville, but a very, very large part of that is working with immigrants, because that is the large population there and where all the need is. So I do see those folks coming together, and I see churches showing up at that. I know there are cases where churches do get also siloed.
I did an internship at St. Margaret's in Washington, D.C. and Yukon, and they partnered with the Underground Rainbow, and we were able to sponsor a gay man from Nicaragua to come in, and they helped him. It took almost a year, full year, to get him out safely of the country But it was, I know it was a little bit of, like you said, the lady who sponsored was pretty exhausted by it.
Yeah,
But
and
they
there
did
was
good.
there was a lot of hope there that the refugee resettlement program could be kind of rethought to be a private sponsorship, where church groups and, you know, even families of people that wanted to come over, needed to come over, those folks would be able to sponsor them, but because the travel itself was banned, it wasn't just the money being pooled. If just the money had been pooled, then groups could have tried to fill that gap. It would have been hard because it was a lot, but, and there was a lot of hope, I think, leading up into 2025, when that was all cut, that we could transfer it over and that it would protect the refugee resettlement program, and so things like that could happen. And I know some of those organizations that resettle LGBTQ refugees, especially that are doing a lot in Canada, thought that they would be able to do that here in the US more, and unfortunately that has just stopped because people can't come in.
The history piece that I'm making on is how do you, and this is the thought my question, how do you connect people who were involved in the 70s in refugee resettlement, who are still part of Episcopal churches, into sort of bringing that experience, because I know there's these long-standing relationships that families created. You know, what wisdom can they bring to parishes in terms of their work that they did 50 years ago? And I know 2025 is just such a stark moment, because lots of border ministries right now, well, until 2025, during the Biden years, some Episcopal border ministries specifically were working with LGBTQ folks who were going to be asylum seekers. So I know that was happening in Arizona, it was happening in one of the refugee homes in the Rio Grande, near El Paso, that were trying to specifically work in this sort of niche. Diocesan programs with local volunteers trying to do this specific work, which is, I think, where that rainbow curriculum also that came about was these border ministries specifically during the Biden years. Because so many people coming from the Northern Triangle are specifically LGBT folks fleeing specific LGBT violence. But if you can't pay for it,
Yeah, yeah.
what do you do?
It's definitely time to rethink how we do it, and I know people are doing that already. It's time to rethink how we do that. People are doing that already, but there's still a lot of figuring out. How do we do it now?
The thought that comes to my mind is, you know, Becca talked about staying and, you know, keeping the work going. And what I'm thinking is, you know, that now it may need to become like the, what is it? You know, like the American churches that, you know, helped people underground leave countries like Russia and China in the 60s and 70s under communism, or the people who, you know, other people who, you know, smuggled Bibles, and it's almost like we're going to have to create, we're going back to slavery, we're going to have to create our own underground railroad is kind of what.
Yeah, one of those organizations is called Rainbow Railroad after
That's
after
Rainbow
that.
Railroad.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
so-
the one they were working with, Rainbow Railroad, because they are, but things are, I think, a little easier in Canada at the moment.
Yeah. My question has to do with people who've had refugee status now for a long time, who've resettled. And as I understand, the Trump administration has been going after some of those refugee categories. Is there anything that is being done when their status is revoked? And are there any people trying to, or part of the church is trying to work with those people who are not finding themselves
really under threat after having been, I mean, some of the Vietnamese refugees have been here 40 years and they're being challenged. Anything that, within that then, are LGBT people even more vulnerable? Are they among people that are really getting, targeted within that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two vulnerabilities already there. There are already LGBTQ people are being targeted and immigrants are being targeted, and if you're both, you're double, at least being doubly targeted. Probably more than that is, you know, race is also being targeted, and you know, as far as LGBTQ refugees and asylum seekers, they're often coming from certain South American countries, places like Uganda, where it's, you know, illegal and they can face some pretty bad consequences, life-threatening situations, and so they are, yes, they're being targeted and being sent back. I know there was a case of a gay man who was sent to one of the prisons in South America, and it's doubly unsafe because once everybody knows, once you've come out, especially if you've come out because you were seeking status for that reason, now it's out, and it was already dangerous for folks to, maybe they're living in refugee camps, to come out of the closet. A lot of folks who were LGBTQ, who came as refugees or asylum seekers, didn't claim it for that reason, because it was unsafe where they were in the in-between time to make that claim. They might not claim it because there's a lot of bias. If you don't look like you're LGBTQ, if you're maybe a trans person, but you're not dressing that way to protect yourself, anything that you would do to protect yourself, which many of us have done in our lives to protect ourselves, would look like you're not really, you know, not really legitimate. So it was already dangerous before, and now it's, you know, doubly, triply dangerous. As far as like people working with those folks, I think that there's a lot of folks who are working with people. I mean, I know here we have an organization, the Tennessee Justice Center, that has attorneys that are helping people as much as they can. There's a lot of folks who are on the streets watching out for ICE and making sure people know their rights. And you know, it's hard for some of these folks who came here legally as refugees and they have all the right status, but if they get pulled over, their English is not very good, and so, you know, they're at risk even if they are clearly have legal status. But there are people working with it, but I think there's probably a lot more room to figure out how to do that the best way. Yeah.
I mean, I come from a blue state where most of the political discourse is between like liberals and progressives attacking each other, and I've been shocked by some of the political ads here. There was a gubernatorial candidate who was like, well, we don't even want Starbucks to come here because they do DEI and they like trans people, and his tagline was, if you're gonna come to Tennessee, you should become Tennessee. And that would just knock me off my behind. And so I'm thinking about the work you're doing, and there's some complexity with your outgoing bishop as well, theologically where he stood. And so thinking about this, I'm kind of like, well, gee, I would imagine that the white Afrikaners, who are the only people who can claim refugee status now, will want to come here in Tennessee. So I'm not asking about that, but what I want to say is thank you, first of all, for upending some of my political shock that I had on engaging some of your political ads. Where do you see hope in the way that people are coming together? Like, what are you seeing? What are you hoping for? What are you longing for? What's your prayer for this industry going forward?
Yeah. I see hope. I would say, like, when this first started, 2025, early 2025, you know, my wife was really scared. And she has legal status. Her English is so good, I almost don't hear an accent. It's very rare to have an accent. She's been here honestly, she came as an adult, so it's kind of odd that she doesn't have much of an accent, but she is very adaptable. And so, you know, we felt some fear, even though we have things that, you know, would protect us that some folks don't. And so at first it was hard to, I think, feel like there was some hope. What has made me feel hopeful is seeing communities come together to try to protect people. Seeing communities come together to stand up for their neighbors. I know we're seeing that a lot on TV, but also seeing it in our own community. Seeing at the cathedral where I go here, they had a day where they brought in a bunch of the organizations and people to come speak about the situation, and it just feels like everybody wants things to be better and is trying to do what they can and taking the training to know how to document things when they happen, and learning how to do that. And for me, that has been hopeful. I've seen more people who have not seen it involved in any immigration stuff in the past, or who maybe had never spoken up before who have spoken up. For me, that has been hopeful. It's still scary and it's still a hard time. But I think just people coming together has been the most hopeful thing.
Odd question. What happened to the money appropriated by General Convention for EMN? Did Sean Rowe just yank that?
So I don't know. I can't tell you
Not
exactly.
exactly.
I know that there was still money in the UTO grant that was going to. They were talking about right before it all shut down. They were talking about possibly hiring me to do some technical assistance with churches that were helping to resettle asylum seekers, and there were other folks, who had been working on some things, and so I know that money still existed to some extent.
There's still staff for EMM.
And there is still a small
They're still doing
staff.
advocacy work and.
Yeah, there's still a small staff, and then they may have had, because that bulk of that, with refugee resettlement, like, it's a huge amount of money that kept these organizations afloat, and so the money that was coming in from, like, the Episcopal Church or with the Lutheran organization that I worked with, the money that was coming in from Lutherans and donors was really small, and it was small in comparison. And so I'm imagining that they filled some of those gaps. The staff that they kept on with that little bit of money.
Most of the money in the budget, correct, most of the money we came from the federal government.
Right.
And
Yeah.
the small amount that's in the church-wide budget was really for the church relations people, which is like House of Duval.
So like that's DC.
And now Kendall is no longer on the staff, and
Yeah.
Allison now is part of the DC department.
Yeah.
And Sarah Shipman, she's still,
Yeah.
who's the director.
Yeah.
That might be it, might just be.
So they're
Sarah.
doing lobbying, but
Doesn't
not.
matter.
But
They're
doing educational
They
meetings.
were doing those like weekly online
Those
seminars,
Tuesday-
EMM
yeah,
and
those Tuesday
OGR
calls.
was doing the for immigrant.
They do a weekly Tuesday call,
Updates, yeah.
which has the legal person, answering a lot of legal questions, which is helpful for the church, and then the advocacy person, and then the secretary. So
Because in New York, a lot of this is our rural minor ministry is doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be something to think about as far as what is Episcopal Migrations Ministry role, what is their role now that we don't have this huge amount of funding coming from the government? What is the role, and how can they support churches, because a lot of churches are on the ground trying to do work, and how can they support them better?
Yes, we-
Valerie, did you get a question?
I did.
Valerie? I have a nightmare, that's a different nightmare, as a historian. All of this is now so scattered and local, that how we're going to be able to capture and tell that story becomes very difficult when we find, as we start to try to write a history of this stuff. Because it is all now out in local areas under all sorts of local groups. Is there any way we can start to think about how those kinds of things can be brought together in a way that the story doesn't get lost and it doesn't get fragmented to the point where we can't tell it all?
I think that's a great idea. I'll tell you two things. One is that when far as being able to, a regular person being able to look up all that information that the Rainbow Initiative put together, it's not there anymore. I'm sure it still exists somewhere, and hopefully it's getting filed away so that we have it for the future, but a lot of that stuff is gone. And so that is one issue. I guess the other thing is having done local ministry type stuff, like the work that we did with LGBTQ folks just in this diocese, especially since it was not officially sponsored, as having a diocese that was not supportive of that. I've realized that we don't have that stuff anywhere. We have it sitting in like our emails. I never delete my emails ever, and so I have everything. But you know, it's sitting in my email. It's not anywhere. I have a couple of buttons from that time, and they're rusting. And it was really looking at those buttons that are starting to rust that made me realize that we don't have this stuff anywhere written down so that somebody can know in the future what's going on. So I do think figuring out some kind of place where the churches and the small groups that are doing this work can send over some of that stuff would be a great idea.
I think it's very important to invest as a church, invest money and invest time and effort and proximity. Because if we as a church are invested in proximity and bring the resources in, we are going to have people who can tell that story, who can take pictures, who can go to conferences and present, right? And we can create those spaces with conferences or publications or whatever is needed. But I think the deeper issue is that we're very comfortable as a church giving money to the organizations and letting them do the work for us, right? There is no proximity. So right now I'm offering pastoral care to people who are LGBTQIA, who are immigrant undocumented. And when we started serving them, it was a really hard thing to do. It was extremely, extremely hard. One of them was on the streets in Nashville, ill, almost dying, and it had to get to that point, right? And then we found out that there was family around, and so we're like, hey, would you care to like hang out with brother, right? That is very hard stuff. So, but now that we've been like three months of that work, now the money's starting to come in. Like the community has listened to the stories through our justice ministry, and they're like, what do you need? Do you need beds? Do you need shoes? Do you need money for an apartment? What do you need, right? So it's starting to come together at a very local level, right? St. Augustine's is very different from the rest of the diocese. But hopefully, this is where I think we need the system, we need EMM come to the diocese and say, what are you doing? How can we help? We heard the St. Augustine's doing this great thing. Why don't you support them, right? Yeah. Work with the bishops. I think it has to come from both ways. And then the system of power that we're living under, repression, is intentionally disrupting everything, right? It's not only disrupting the flow of money, but it's disrupting our capacity to tell the story, because we are not part of the story. We are being taken out of the equation so that we are in proximity to tell the story. And I think that's where this is very, very dangerous. And we need to be able to recognize that and be intentional and maybe challenge ourselves to do a little bit of the hard thing.
Jordan, I don't know, like, there's the issue of the Latino archives, and rightly, I wonder, so Cornell has like a human sexuality collection, it's one of the oldest, Cornell, and I'm wondering if they could be a depository, like my papers will go there, right? So, if I can hack together on that, but then do something with what they're receiving.
They actually can't receive money,
Right.
right? So,
Right.
so it's, we've been trying to become a conduit, for example, for Latinx archive, and the Historical Society, we can bring money in and be a pass-through, right, for the archives to do something, and we've been willing to do that. And that's an in process, but, the archives itself doesn't have the staff, and it can't even, manage money that way. It's not allowed to.
When you say we, you mean the Episcopal
Yeah.
Society, that's the we.
Yeah, the Historical Society of the Episcopal Church, yes.
Cause even like Louis Crew, like his, like, it's so complicated, like he was a depository of LGBTQ history for like 30 years. And then, like, nobody had a password to some of the stuff that he had, right? And I do think that some of his stuff actually finally has ended up at Rutgers. But like, there's not a publication like The Witness anymore that people are writing for. You know, like it's sort of like, how do you create a culture again? It's not, I mean, epistemologically, it doesn't have to be written for it to be valuable. So I'm very aware of that, but that can capture this in a way that makes research 20 years from now.
I think I'm especially sensitive to it because the kind of thing that I was working on with reservation is another thing that has just slipped through the cracks because it was all local. And in Diocese of Minnesota, where there was the major events this last year, the Diocese of Minnesota's archives are in the Minnesota Historical Society. And the Minnesota Historical Society is underfunded. It is much less what the diocese is. But it is, people have to intentionally save and intentionally capture some of it in order to then even pass it on. And I think that's one of the things that all of us, in a sense, can be involved in, but we need to know where we can then put those things, where they will be able to be found and not in 700 different places.
I think the church has a responsibility here for more than one reason, but one is the danger of that information to people. That I didn't think in my lifetime we would have a government that would go after things, right? And go after documentation and turn it around, right, on the very people that you're meaning to honor and preserve. And in that case, the church has a way to stand on separation of church and state, right, in a way that creates a barrier that can be violated, no doubt, but nonetheless is there. And we may have to push the Episcopal Church to do its duty in this, even if the archive right now isn't equipped to deal with it. But I'm worried about how that information will be used. Historically, I understand the value, but this is the first draft of history, and we're in the news cycle, and I'm a little worried about it.
I do agree with that. As somebody who lives in Minnesota, my neighbors are now subject to being charged with federal crimes for having been in a signal chat to let people know when ICE was outside of the school across the street from me. So the history, particularly around refugees and immigrants right now, we are very much in it and putting people at risk to say, we need you to write down your story so we can stick it in a central location. And that is kind of how the Episcopal Church is operated. We're going to centralize everything. And what we're realizing is that the really interesting stuff is not in the central location. It's not at the center. It is out in the margins, as you all decided when you created the thing for this conference. And so we just have to be, this is why with my technology stuff, how am I going to document stuff? I'm hiring a Gen Z consultant who's going to say, listen, boomer, that's not how it's going to work, and we're going to do things a little bit differently. And I think we just have to be open to that, particularly around immigration, migration, refugee status. People are, I can show you my naturalization papers, they are in my purse. They have my 3rd grade school picture on them from 1972. I do not leave the house. lost without this antique document. We are very much still at risk.
Yes.
Something you said during the presentation, reminded me of a book that's come out by Jesse Zink, and I can't remember the name of it, but it is talking about how we are approaching some of the things we're trying to do and recognizing when it's over or when we've got our butts kicked. And when you said, this is now history, and I'm like, yes, all right, so now history, it's like, we needed that to be said, and now that automatically shifts, because our strategy, as opposed to wrangling about what's going on, it's like, it's already done. We need a strategy, especially as historians, to start collecting this information. So thank you for that.
Is anybody here going to the, I'm not able to go to the conference on the 50th anniversary of A069. You are? So A069, 1976, the resolution that said that homosexuals are children of God and should have been a mic drop. Issue done. I wonder if there's a strategy in that particular thing to invite people to bring archival things to that conference, so that they can be sort of a depository can be created for, you know, like the 8069 archive.
It's being organized by a task force.
Right.
So if you know Susan Russell, I think she's the chair of the task force. I think it's a great idea. I would reach out to the task force, but there's a reason why it's being handled by a task force and not by DFMS staff.
Right, and I love Susan, and who are the people of color also who are carrying that history?
Yes, no, I'm just,
Yeah.
she's the person who put her email address out there. To
Right.
contact her.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a great
That would be
suggestion.
like an interesting,
I think that's a great idea.
to sort of bring the archival boxes and,
I mean, this piece will be part of the online YouTubes along with the rest of the conference.
Right.
But that document's one little
right.
corner. And we just have to be very conscious, even if we can't put it out into the public yet. We have to be conscious, because if we don't save the records or we don't do the oral histories, there ain't gonna be none for this stuff.
And they agreeing and finding ways to keep this stuff safe and also not either, if it's LGBTQ, not put people at risk with the government, either as immigrants or as LGBTQ people or even as people of color. Like, how can we gather this, but also kind of keep it in places where, like, that's great that they're celebrating the 50th anniversary, and that's probably getting publicized. We don't necessarily want people to know that we're collecting.
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
it's just a matter
protecting, saying to people, okay, if you can bring these things, we're creating a safe way to keep it.
and I think that's where the archivists who are professional at this know
Yeah.
that, you're.
Well, I was just going to say, and it's